it's just incredibly hard to write a ton of code and not be a good programmer.
Welcome back to the Free Code Camp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. Each week, we're bringing you insight from developers, founders, and ambitious people getting into tech. This week, we're talking with Rahul Pandey. He's a software engineer who left his $800,000 a year FAANG job to build his own startup. We're going to talk about the post-layoff developer job landscape, developer interviews, salary negotiation, and landing venture capital as a startup founder, and more. Rahul, pleasure to have you here, man.
Quincy, thank you for having me. It's been really fun to collaborate with you and FreeCodeCamp over the past few years. I'm excited to chat.
Absolutely. And I am going to put a link to one of Rahul's courses. He has a comprehensive Android app tutorial. It's about 4 hours long if anybody wants to see his teaching in action. But I just want to start by acknowledging, Rahul, that you are one of the winners of the tech boom in that you've been able to build your network, your skills, your reputation over the past few years. But there are a lot of people who've been laid off recently who may not feel like they have a lot to show for the time that they spent working in tech. What would you say to someone who approached you who thought that they might have made a mistake learning to code and getting into tech?
I would say it's not too late. It's never too late to get into tech. It's never too late to learn these, what I would consider fundamental skills of working with computers and working with software. I've been coding or thinking about tech in some capacity since I was 18, and I'm 32 now, right? So I've been doing it for a long, long time. And I think when people come to me and say, hey, I've been doing it for 3 months or 6 months, it's not making sense to me. I'll say, hey, you still have another 15, 20 years until you can say that you've been doing it for enough time or a long enough time. So that's one thing. It's like, the key is put the time in, be persistent, have a system so you don't get discouraged. The other thing I would say is that we are very, very early in software. I fundamentally believe that the amount of time and energy and money going into computing, into working with computers, that will only go up in the coming years. And so, I came into college and I thought, okay, there are people around me who have been coding since they were 5 years old. It's too late for me. But it was not too late for me. It's not too late for you. The amount of stuff that will get done with software in the coming years is going to be huge. And I think anyone who wants to be part of it can be part of it as long as they work smart and they work hard.
Awesome. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about working smart and working hard, which is how you got to where you are today. And we're going to tease as many insights as we can out of your developer journey. Let's go way back to when you were a kid, Hindi-speaking son of immigrants, a second-generation American in Detroit, Michigan. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your early years and what life was like for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think my childhood was very similar to the second-generation immigrant experience. So my parents came here for higher education in the 1980s, and then the majority of my dad's career ended up at General Motors, which is how we ended up in Michigan, in the Detroit area. And so I always had, my parents valued education, and it was always a huge part of what I spent every day doing. So this school, and then you come back and study a bit more beyond the homework that you already had to do. So I think that was a big part of my own childhood. And then, of course, you always have, there's a small Indian community when I was growing up in the Detroit area. And then in school, it was majority non-Indian, majority white. And so you always had that kind of dichotomy, which I think is super common for the second generation on how did I balance, you speak Hindi. Actually, we spoke a dialect of Hindi called Bhojpuri at home. And then in school, it's a very different culture, very different language, and how much Indianness do you want to show, right? And that was a very common thing for me and that community that I grew up with. I think school and academics were definitely a huge part of what I did my life growing up, but I actually never thought too much about the future. Like I can't recall ever saying to my dad, oh, I really, really want to be a mechanical engineer like you. I really want to work with cars. That was never somehow a big part of my life. And even for computers, which is what I spend every day, coding and programming and software engineering is what I think about every day now. It never really came up growing up somehow. It was only in college when I really started to think about, okay, what do I have some agency of, what do I want to do? I think growing up for me, a lot of it was put my head down, do the work. My brother was very into math competitions, so we do a lot of math competitions, but I never really thought about how will the work I'm doing now translate into a career or a job in the future.
Yeah. Well, at what point, you said you went to college, and that's when your discovery of, I guess, what you wanted to do with your life started to begin. I mean, for most people, that's an ongoing discovery process, and they go down one road and then they switch, and maybe the road that they went down has a nice kind of intersection with the other road and there's a natural transition, or maybe it's a very dramatic, I've talked to a lot of people that work at, I talked to someone who's working as a sign language interpreter with American Sign Language who's learning to code. And I mean, those two things on the face of it would seem very different, but they're trying to figure out kind of a natural bridge between the two. Or people I know who are working as truck drivers or working as mechanics and other things like that want to transition into software development. So maybe you can set the stage. You're in university. You've worked very hard to get there. You've followed the teaching of your first generation immigrant parents. Of course, I hope I don't seem presumptive or anything like that, but I have lots of friends from Vietnam, from China, from India, especially, who have these parents who basically drill it into them. You have to do well academically. It doesn't even matter what you do other than that. Academics have to come first. Was that how it was in your household? Did your parents really hold you to a high standard as far as grades and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think they definitely had high standards, but it wasn't so much in the form of, you need to study or else you'll get punished. It didn't feel like that. I think a lot of it was my brother, actually. So I have an older brother, 2 years older, and he was academically, I think naturally, incredibly talented, especially when it came to math. And so I think a lot of it, I actually remember feeling like it wasn't my parents who were pressuring me. It was most of the time my brother saying, hey, you better, stay up late to train for this math competition. And that was a huge thing for me. And I never actually did as well in, there was something called AMC and AIME, which were two big math competitions growing up. And I never did as well as him. But that was a huge point of anxiety for me. It's I really need to do well. And that took over. I think, going back to what we talked about, I never really thought about a career or a job because I was so myopically focused on how do I do well right now and, show my brother or my parents or whoever that I can actually succeed beyond school in this math competition or in this, there were other things going on at the same time. And so that was what took over. And then it was only until college when I could, remove the local pressure of a math competition. And that was when I feel like I had the freedom to think a little bit broader about what I actually wanted to do in my career. And that was, I think, really powerful for me. I wish I could have done that a little bit earlier. But, I think it was, age 17, 18 is when I finally started to think about that.
Yeah. So potential parenting advice there for me as someone who has young kids, instead of pushing your kids academically, just try to get your kids surrounded by high achieving motivated kids and let that peer pressure compel them rather than trying to.
And I think that's actually way more powerful because they are your peer. You can't make a claim that, my dad, he doesn't understand, or my mom doesn't understand because they came from a different generation or a different geography. No, this is my brother. He literally went to the same exact school, just 2 years ahead of me. Or if I have other friends who went through the same system. And actually that was one of the, I would say, the biggest benefit of Stanford, way more powerful than the academics or the campus or anything else. The biggest benefit was you had a peer group at Stanford who opened your eyes to what would be possible. If you had a little bit of luck, a lot of hard work, you put yourself in the right position to succeed, you could do anything, which I didn't even think was possible in Michigan. And that was a huge benefit of Stanford, was that peer group that you enter into.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can talk about your early days at Stanford. Getting into Stanford, of course, is very difficult. I'm not sure if it's even more difficult now than it used to be.
So it's way more difficult now.
Yeah. Well, so you get this. I understand you got into a lot of prestigious schools, but how did you prepare? How did you pull that off?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe there is like a benefit to how I grew up too, and I was so focused on high school, I didn't think about other things. I was just like, okay, math competitions. I did some science stuff, and then I, did well, like doing well in classes with the baseline. Like, of course, you would do well in classes. And on top of that, it was a discussion with my brother or my parents about, okay, what else to do. So I think part of it is certainly like I got lucky going to Stanford. Like what I tell people or parents or high school students is that there are a lot of good schools in the country. And so rather than getting your heart set, oh, I really want to go to Harvard, I really want to go to Stanford, that I think is a recipe for disappointment. The top 10 or top 20 schools, all of them have that same amazing peer group of people who will go on and do startups. They'll go on and become executives somewhere. They'll go on and do something really innovative. And so as long as you get into one of those top 20, I think you're going to be set up for a really amazing future. And so if you think about the probability of getting into any one college as like, let's say 20%. So then the likelihood that you get rejected by all the top 20 is actually quite low. It's like, what is that? 0.8 to the power of 20. So it's like, I don't know what the math is, but I would just, what my advice to people is that instead of just focusing on one university, just run the gamut and figure out how you'll get into one of them probably if you're a high academic achiever, and just go into the best school you can.
Yeah, and for anybody curious, 0.8 to the 20th power is 1%. So like, so you're 99% likely to get into a top 20 school, assuming you meet like the basic criteria for applying and stuff like that. Yeah, that's really good. Man, this just brings me to one of the things that you have talked about a lot in like your videos and like podcasts I've listened to you talk. You talked about the role of quantity, and there's that quote that quantity has a quality all its own. And for you, like you have approached a lot of things as kind of a numbers game. Like I'm not just going to apply to my dream university. I'm going to apply to a bunch of universities. I'm just going to apply to, Google. I'm going to apply to a bunch of Google tier employers, right? Maybe you can talk just for a second as a segue, because this is a very natural time to talk about this, about the role of quantity in your decision making and your approach to life.
Yeah, there's such a huge part of how I think about success and how I think about my own journey is just really focus on quantity. Don't think of yourself as an artist where you're like an artisan crafting every pixel on the screen or every video you put out or every college application. Hey, we're going to do our best, but we're also going to maintain a really high velocity so we can hit the quantity bar. And I think there's two benefits. One is what you said, is that I truly believe that the more quantity you put out, the higher your quality will become, just naturally. It's just very hard for, the thing that I think about a lot is programming. It's just incredibly hard to write a ton of code and not be a good programmer. So that's part of it. The other part of it too, which I think is equally powerful, is a psychological element of quantity over quality, which is that it relieves you of the pressure to make every single attempt at whatever you're doing to be amazing. And when you reduce that pressure, you want to do it more. And that is a huge unlock. So rather than saying, hey, this code I write right now is going to have to be perfect, bug-free and efficient and work on the first try, I'll never write code because I'm going to be so afraid of screwing it up. And same thing with colleges. If I tell myself or if I tell the world that the only college I really care about is Stanford, that is make or break. If I don't get into Stanford, I don't care about anything else. I'm going to be so stressed out, and I'll probably do worse in the application because I'm going to be over-editing it and thinking about it too much, and it'll just be counterproductive. So if you instead have leverage by saying, hey, Stanford is one good option, but so is Harvard or Caltech or MIT or Carnegie Mellon or whatever else, then I can almost guarantee that you're going to come in a much healthier mindset, and that healthier mindset will lead to better performance.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your time at Stanford. And did you know from the time that you enrolled there that you were going to study engineering and follow in the steps of your father? Now, I know that you said he studied mechanical engineering, working in the car industry. That's kind of like almost like the tech industry of yore, in my opinion. I mean, you could argue that like there's a lot of innovation going on in the car space too, but like I consider transportation somewhat soft compared to like all the new novel systems we're coming up with, like LLMs and search engines and all the more recent tools. But did you know that you wanted to study engineering right from the get-go, or at what point did you start to go down that path?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely knew that I wanted to do something analytical. So I think if I think back to when I was 17, coming into university, I think the majors I had thought about were electrical engineering or physics. I maybe mechanical too, but certainly I was not at all considering like medicine or English or history. I knew I wanted to do something with numbers and something which was a bit more analytical.
Yeah. And what did you do with those, I guess, around 4 years that you were you at Stanford? Yeah.
I ended up being at Stanford for 5 years. So the reason is that they have a program called coterm, like a coterm program. And the idea is that you can concurrently, for a portion of your undergrad, you can start to work on a master's degree. And so I think in my third year, I applied for that program, and I was able to do a master's degree in computer science as well. I did bachelor's and master's in computer science. I did both of them in 5 years. So that was why I stuck around for an additional year. And also, frankly, I think my job prospects at the end of 4 years was not that strong. And so having one more year in the Stanford bubble, the academic bubble, really helped me strengthen my profile and give me confidence that I could actually go out and get whatever job I wanted. So that was another huge benefit of it. I think in terms of the what I did, I came in with that mindset of something analytical, something in the engineering realm, or maybe science, physics realm. Very quickly, I would say by the end of freshman year, it became very obvious to me that the best thing I could do is go study software and coding, because there was so much energy. This is 2010. And there was so much energy around software. Like the iPhone had come out. I had people down the hall from me who were making iPhone apps and doing really well. And these are people who I didn't think that, growing up, I didn't really know any software engineers who were just doing, I knew engineers in the context of they were at Accenture and they worked as part of 20,000 engineers doing a small thing. But this is the first time where I felt like, hey, as a 18 or 20-year-old, you can actually go out and create something valuable and make money from it. So very quickly, I was okay, this is the thing I'm going to do. And after second year, sophomore year, I very quickly decided, okay, this is going to be what I want to end up working on, at least initially when I graduate.
So you hit the ground running. I understand you had a number of internships while you were going through your degree program. Can you talk about those?
Yeah. I had an internship every single summer. So that's 4 different internships. And I think that was, again, one of the benefits of going to the top university like Stanford, is that people assume some level of credibility, which honestly, I don't think I deserved. I remember my first year, I had literally taken, I didn't really program at all coming into college, unlike a lot of my peers. And so I did feel some amount of imposter syndrome, or I felt behind to some extent. I had taken a grand total of 2 programming classes, and I somehow landed an internship. And the reason is because I believe it's in March or April, so near the end of the academic year, Stanford has a startup career fair. And these startups, they just want to hire. And especially if you say, hey, I went to Stanford, for them, it's kind of like, oh, I was able to hire a Stanford kid to come and intern. And so I was just super lucky that I honestly didn't have the skills to contribute. And that whole summer, I really was struggling. There was not a formal discussion about if I got a return offer or not, but I can almost for sure tell you that I would not have received one if I had that conversation. And so, yeah, I think I just kind of fell into that internship because they wanted someone from Stanford, and I had it seemed like I was interested. And then every single summer, I felt like I made dramatic improvements into my productivity as an engineer and feeling competent. Like the first summer, I really didn't know what I was doing. But the last summer, I interned at Facebook in 2013. I felt very comfortable, actually, to figure out how to manage a software project and figure out what change I needed to make in order to make progress.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about Facebook, and we will get to that because I understand you worked there for a number of years doing Android development. But what was your, after that internship, did that convert into a job, or did you go work other places? What did you do upon completing your 5 years at school?
Yep. So at the end of my last internship, 2013, I was actually kind of borderline, but I was very lucky to get the return offer at Facebook, and that was a huge confidence boost. And then Stanford has this really nice policy where if you get an offer from an internship, then Stanford will allow you to get 2 or 3 months to just go out and recruit other places too. The idea being that they don't want the company to force a student to immediately accept or reject without having data points from other companies. And so from September up until mid-October, I went on a sprint and I interviewed and talked to a bunch of companies. I ended up collecting 4 other offers. So I ended up with 5 offers. And I made a video about that actually, where I talked about the actual numbers and what it felt like.
It's a great video. And I will link to that video in the description. But if you can just kind of verbally summarize some of these offers.
This is like really like the pinnacle of when I felt confident, because it was like every single summer I did an internship. I got so many rejections from all the companies I really wanted to work at. But finally, this September through October period in 2013, I felt like, okay, now I actually come into interviews with confidence rather than feeling like I'm just super scared of what question am I going to ask. And so I ended up, if I recall correctly, Google, Twitter, Block, or at that time it was called Square, Facebook, of course, and then Microsoft. So five companies I got offers from. And I felt like, okay, I made it. It was like some element of like, these are the companies I literally heard about growing up. And I am getting offers from them. It felt like this really cool full circle moment from someone who hadn't really programmed at all coming into college, and now at the end of it had gotten all these offers. Yeah. What's interesting is that after I had gone through that whole process, a professor of mine, when I was doing research during the academic year in my 5th year, he came to me and said, "Hey, Rahul, like I know you have these offers at the big tech companies, but I am thinking about starting a company." And that was like very hard to turn down. And so we can talk about that if you're interested.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Not doing the big tech company, and I ended up doing the startup.
Wow. So you had 5 offers on the table from some of the biggest brand namest tech companies, and you walked away from those to work for your professor. Yeah.
It's so funny because I feel like, I honestly did feel so grateful and so happy, at least initially, that, wow, okay, these are the companies I really dreamed about, even at the beginning of college. If you landed an internship at Google or Facebook, that was a big deal. It's like, wow, you must be competent. You must be legit if you were able to. But human psychology is such a weird thing, because as soon as I got the offers, somehow they became less valuable to me. And so I think part of it was just like, I got it and I felt like, I did it. I don't need to now go work there. And part of it also, I think there was some element of ego. Of Google and Facebook, they're going to hire 1,000 college graduates in the next year. I don't want to be one of 1,000. I want to go be special. And when a professor, like someone in a position of power, frankly, comes to you and says, "Hey, I've been seeing your work. I think you'd be a really great fit for this brand new endeavor that I'm starting out." It's a classic Silicon Valley story. Professor does a company, it's a ton of smart people. You graduate from Stanford and you join it. Like, how could you say no to that? And so I did end up, that was kind of the thought process in my head.
I mean, that's how Google started, right? Like Google was a bunch of Stanford PhDs, or 2 Stanford PhDs, who just grabbed a bunch of their classmates and went and created, a multi-trillion-dollar market cap corporation, right? So I can definitely understand the appeal of that. On the note of you having those offers in hand and them just not feeling as appealing, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and Spock, rest in peace, Leonard Nimoy, has this quote where he says, having is not so pleasing a thing as wanting. It is not logical, but it is often true. So I think once you had those, it's just like the novelty of the shininess wore off, and you're like, what else is shiny? You look up from the treasure in your hand, and you start to see all the other treasure out there, right? The world becomes your oyster.
Yeah, that's so true. And I mean, it's a classic quote of like, the journey is more valuable than the destination. But like, focus on the journey, not the destination. I think that was so true. And there's also one more element too, of, hey, big tech, it will be big tech for a long time. Like, I don't anticipate Google or Facebook to go anywhere. In fact, they've only grown in power and market cap since 2013 when I graduated. And so there was also an element of, hey, if this is an opportunity that I don't think I will easily be able to replicate, which is with the startup with the professor, then I would rather do that action or do that opportunity now. Whereas I can hopefully, if I have gained the skills now to get a job at Google, hopefully I can repeat that in 2 or 3 years if I wanted to. So there's that element of scarcity, I think, or like the worry that it might disappear, that also I think triggered ending up to join the startup.
Yeah, the fear of missing out, the FOMO.
Yes, exactly, FOMO.
So we're going to talk about what you learned working for your prof, and we're also going to talk a little bit about software engineering concepts and skills you picked up. But I do want to draw an immediate parallel to you taking a chance on your professor's company to later you having this this fateful meeting with WhatsApp.
Yeah.
It was WhatsApp, right?
Yeah. Later on, well, the WhatsApp conversation happened like roughly the same time, actually. Like,
okay.
I had I'd gotten this return offer from Facebook, and then at that point they're independent companies.
Yeah.
And so I interviewed at WhatsApp, but at that point, I mean, as you probably recall, like WhatsApp wasn't that big in the U.S. I had like kind of heard of it because I think some relatives of mine in India were using it.
Yeah, it's still not big in the U.S., but it's huge overseas. Like it's like
huge.
India.
I mean, it's actually
like
kind of
that's
crazy
how they communicate. Yeah.
Yeah, as everyone knows, WhatsApp eventually got acquired by Facebook or Meta. And I remember when I worked at Meta for 4.5 years, there were people. They had these user researchers who would go to India, and there were people in India who thought that the internet meant WhatsApp. Like their whole world, their whole conception of the internet was communicating via WhatsApp and getting the weather and getting updates and talking to their friends and family through WhatsApp. That's how dominant WhatsApp has become in India. And so I didn't know that at the time, but I did, get an interview or an offer for WhatsApp, and I talked to the founder, which is super cool. And I ended up turning them down in order to go to Facebook. So, missed opportunity. But
so you would have ended up the same place, but you probably would have ended up with millions.
I would have ended up with like one
extra.
or two extra zeros in my net worth if I had done the WhatsApp offer.
Yeah, but it does like it's not like the story had like a sad ending or anything. You've had a remarkable career so far over the past few years. Let's talk a little bit about that. So you work with your professor, and like what are some? And I want to focus not just on like life lessons you've learned, but also software engineering concepts and things you've kind of learned from the trenches of doing software engineering in both the context of this small tech startup, these giant corporations that you work for, at least one of them, and then of course your startup life now. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So again, I apologize for providing so much exposition, but I just want to like kind of structure the conversation for people following along at home. That is kind of the arc we're going to go from small to big to small, lessons learned along the way. So maybe you can talk about those first few months working for your prof.
Yeah, and so I'll start with the conclusion, and then I'll work backward into like how it felt. So very quickly after I joined, the startup got acquired or acqui-hired by Pinterest. So I joined in summer of 2014. In early 2015, so maybe 6 or 7 months later, it was acquired. And so I remember feeling at the time not super happy about it, honestly. I felt like it was a rug pull. It was like, okay, I joined the startup and I wanted to build something meaningful for the world. And I expected it to take a year, 2 years, probably longer to build something substantial and really make a connection with my coworkers and like learn from them. And I felt like this ended so much more prematurely than what I had bargained for when I initially joined. And so, I mean, certainly you can't complain. Like there was a TechCrunch article about it. I showed my mom that was in TechCrunch with a picture of me. It's like kind of a cool outcome, but not what I had expected. But at the same time, I actually feel like it ended up working out for the better because I actually really struggled during that 6-month period. I told you in my last year at Stanford, I felt very confident. I had gotten all these offers and I was able to pass all the interviews, and within a big company, I felt like I could surgically make changes, like minor changes to do what I wanted. And it was a huge ego hit because I went to the startup. There's no infrastructure, right? Like literally, I was a founding engineer. There was like 4 people working. We were all working together in a conference room, and they just gave me a ton of responsibility. Like, hey, here's this very vague, ambiguous thing. Go figure it out. It was like we were dealing with like data infra. So I was dealing with something called Hive as a way to, store and query data. And I couldn't do it. Like I just didn't have the maturity at that point to be able to decompose a problem, read a GitHub repository, and figure out how to put the pieces together. And I just needed a lot more hand-holding than I think is a good fit for most early-stage startups. And so even though I had mixed feelings about the acquisition, I think looking back, I think being able to go to Pinterest, which is a much bigger company, it was like, I think 400 or 500 people at the time, which felt big. It actually ended up working out really well when we joined in 2015.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that you had trouble kind of like breaking problems down from like abstract specs in the form of like maybe GitHub issues and things like that, or instructions handed down from high by like non-technical managers, perhaps, or other people like that, and you have to figure out how to do this. And that's something like we at FreeCodeCamp are like a very small team. We often have to grapple with such ambiguity. I often tell people that it's really good to go straight from college into working at like a small organization, like a small business, small startup, small charity, something where there's only going to be a few developers. You're going to be able to put your fingers in all the pies, you know? But it sounds like this is the flip side of that, where you didn't really have as many people that you could look to learn from, and there wasn't as much structure to guide your initial foray into software engineering. So in light of all that, like, what would your advice be to people that are just graduating? Let's say they are getting a computer science degree and they have options. They have the option of potentially going and working at a larger company, or like not a company size is not a big deal, but like the team size, I guess. Like what would be the Goldilocks zone for team size for you if you were doing everything over again?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a vacuum, my general advice to a new graduate would be go work in a structured environment. And a structured environment could take many different shapes and forms, but generally that means, in my mind, like a mid-sized or larger company, which has some amount of product market fit. So I think part of the issue here, and I don't think that your advice is necessarily bad. Like if you go work at a nonprofit or if you go work at a smaller company, but it has some amount of structure. Like they have a product, they have customers, there's some amount of like repeatability in the work. I think it could actually be a really good fit to learn ownership and learn how to get things done. With the startup that I joined in 2014, it felt very much like we had done some research academically in the lab that I was part of. And my professor was working very hard to figure out how can we monetize this academic idea. And so there was no real, and also we had taken in, I think, $2 million in funding. We had gone through some incubator or like seed program.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of pressure that you have to grow. Like we have this vague, interesting research. How do we make that commercially viable? And so the combination of a lack of a product, we had no product. There was no talk of product market fit because there was no product yet. And then there's also this element of like, how do we even talk to customers, or how do we make this commercially viable, which I don't think anyone in the company really was that good at. And that's what led to, this kind of not so great experience as a new grad for me.
Okay. So, you get acqui-hired and you transition from kind of like not necessarily knowing what you're doing, to kind of being the proverbial dog at the keyboard, to, I don't know if you remember that old meme, the dog, totally. I have no idea what I'm doing. To suddenly being in a much more structured environment. Pinterest, you said like 400, 500 people working there. Of course, it's a name brand product. Like your aunts and uncles have probably used it in the past. So when you go to family reunions and stuff and you're talking about it, like they have some grasp on, oh yeah, that's like the photo pinboard app or something like, right? So, what did you learn during the first few months once you hit the ground in a larger, more structured environment?
Yeah, so I think one big career transition that happened at Pinterest is that after the startup experience where I was doing a lot of data infra and machine learning stuff, I actively chose to walk away from that, which, maybe in retrospect was a bad decision because right now, as you know, it's like ML, AI is so hot, and recommendation systems, like all of that stuff has only grown in importance. But I think for me, I felt like I wanted to do something more tangible. I wanted to be able to build something and have it show up in the production app, which I didn't have any of that at Kose, with the startup that I was at, just because we didn't have a product, and it was also much more like academic. Like I wanted a product. So I think being able to shift into mobile development, which I ended up doing Android development at Pinterest, that was a big change that I made within the first 6 months of me joining. And the other reason I did that change also is because I cared a lot about going back to 2009 when I first entered Stanford. I saw these people make mobile apps, and they were just on their own shipping a product to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. I wanted that same thing. And so I thought Android would be the easiest way for me to actually start hacking on things on my own, like an indie hacker, and just like be able to publish things. And so over the next few years, I was able to publish several different Android apps, and that was super fun, and also like helped me learn a lot.
Yeah. So you've transitioned to something that's more tangible, like the actual app that, consumers, like the end users of the tool, not some recommendation engine that is completely abstracted away that most people wouldn't even understand it unless you took time to like get out a whiteboard and explain what it's doing and stuff. Like it's just invisible to most people, and you're going to the most tangible layer, the most front end of front end, right? So that's cool that you made that transition. How did you pivot your career or pivot your skills? Like, did you ask for an internal transfer, or did you start working on this? Like how do you go from being somebody working on kind of a recommendation or AI system in the background to a different department within a relatively large company like Pinterest?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it worked out pretty easily. I think one of the things I tell people is that ideally you should go work at a company where you have, by default, a lot of trust and autonomy. And so at Pinterest, there was not any formal process where I have to go apply for a brand new role, or I have to like fill out an application form and talk to 20 people. It was literally within the first few months of me joining, I just told the skip level manager, like, hey, here's what I think could be a really good fit for me and also the company. Here's why it makes sense for both parties. And within a couple of weeks, I was like, oh, yeah, let's make it happen. Here are some opportunities. Here are some projects that could be a good fit. Same thing at Facebook. Like Facebook, I think, is well known for just tons of responsibility and trust given to the engineer. And there are many, many stories of people way more senior than me who like, 10, 15 years of experience, and they did like back-end development. They were building out the continuous integration system or whatever, and they transitioned into iOS development. There are many examples of that. And I think that's a very powerful thing, not only to work at a company like that, but also as the engineer, you should have the confidence that you can easily pivot into a brand new domain. And a lot of your knowledge will carry over. And if you work hard, you can become productive very quickly in a brand new domain.
Okay, awesome. And just to be clear, like just a little vocab, you said skip level engineer. That's like the engineer or skip level manager. That's the manager above your current manager. So you probably had a manager that was overseeing that particular product that you were working on, and you needed to go a level above to get approval to move. Okay, I just want to make sure I have that definition correct. Okay, that's cool. So yes, like Facebook famously, like everybody has access to production. I'm not sure if it's still like that, but like anybody can push to production. Like they've had some outages and stuff like that due to the dark side of being too, I guess, empowering and trusting. But who knows all the invisible improvements that they've been able to rapidly ramp out that would have been mired in bureaucratic procedure had they not had the high level of trust that they have. And like I would say, like this is not an interview of me, but like if I can opine on this very quickly, personally, the way we run Free Code Camp is with a high degree of trust. We're a completely remote team. Everybody has different responsibilities. I am everybody's direct charge, right? Like I'm like kind of an individual contributor working alongside everybody else. We don't want to have this big, bulky hierarchy, expensive hierarchy of like managers and all this stuff. We just want people to be able to work on what they think is the most important. And if they want to shift from one thing to another and they can make kind of like a business case argument, like, hey, this is a good use of scarce donor funds for us to develop this, for example, for like the English curriculum, for example, or making some improvements to some system that some people use but not everybody uses, then like we can greenlight that and they can move over and they can start working on that. And I love that culture of trust, and I'm thrilled to hear that Pinterest had that, and that Facebook, I guess, famously has that or had that. The move fast and break things era. We'll get into some of that. But it sounds like you had a pretty good time and you learned quite a bit. So maybe you can talk about other things that you learned. Maybe you can just rattle off some rapid fire lessons from working at kind of the height of tech alongside really good Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Bay Area software engineers building with contemporary tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pinterest overall was a great experience. I think that one thing that might get overlooked occasionally is a peer group of who you work with matters a lot. And so if you join this old, I'm trying to think of a company like Oracle, not to pick on them, but join some like SAP, Oracle, like this company that's been around for 50 years. Frankly, a lot of your, or maybe I'll give you a more concrete example, General Motors. So I had friends who ended up sticking around in Michigan. They went to like the University of Michigan, did mechanical engineering, and they took a job at Ford or General Motors. And the median age of one of the workers there is like 50 or 45. And that's not a bad thing. But if you're a 22-year-old and you're looking for that level of cohesion and learning and opportunity, and there's a lot of people above you who are at a different life stage, that can cause some amount of conflict. Or maybe not conflict, but it can cause some tension of like you wanted to move faster and you can't. So at Pinterest, it was a relatively young company at the time. I think it was founded in 2010 or 2009. And so, still relatively young. Most of the engineers were actually quite young. Like they were all, these mid 20, early 30s folks. And there was a cultural cohesion that I think was super valuable. So that was one thing. It's like in a job, don't just think about the work or the project. Think about who are the people you're going to be working with. Another thing that comes to mind is growth. Growth effectively solves all problems. So like it doesn't matter if
masks problems. Certainly.
Yes, it masks all problems. So like it doesn't matter if you're like, oh, my manager is like they said something weird to me, or like, like this project didn't go as well. But Pinterest at the time, it just felt like this. Like I worked on a project which actually ended up not working out at all, and they killed it. It was called shopping or buyable pins, where you could actually buy a product directly in Pinterest. Totally failed. But the core of Pinterest, which was about discovering images and saving them to different pin boards, that was such a strong product. And it was growing internationally at the time, it was growing domestically at the time. Every month, you would see this dramatic growth in users, which you knew that the company would succeed. And that led to, rather than a mindset of scarcity, where people were always arguing about what project to take on, there was actually an opposite mindset where it's like, hey, if you want to help, we'll load you up with tons of responsibility. We'll give you feedback. You can do whatever you want. And I think that's another huge lesson, is that's why Silicon Valley, I think, works the way it does, is that there's an addiction to growth, because that addiction to growth is what allows you to mess up a lot and still succeed at the end. And so you want to ideally work in an environment which is growing rapidly, and you can take on as much as you're able to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about, is the fact that to some extent, like, growth has slowed a little bit, like venture capital funding has slowed. And a lot of people, like I saw an excellent talk that I'm going to link to in the description by a pragmatic engineer, where he did like a conference talk, and he talked about the correlation between the Federal Reserve's risk-free rate, the Fed rate. I can't remember all the words that you use to describe this rate, but basically we had like near zero interest rates for a very long time during the big startup boom, the app revolution, where companies like Pinterest, like Facebook, like Instagram, like WhatsApp were gaining hundreds of millions of users, and were able to just grow so quickly that they could do whatever they wanted, because they had this abundance mindset, and they didn't feel risk aversion like they would feel if the coffers were suddenly tightened. And I think for a long time there were very few layoffs and things like that. To some extent, that has been reversed with the rise in interest rates, which disincentivizes speculative investment from venture capitalists. My understanding of the way it works is, if you are the Saudi Arabian government, or if you're the California pension CalPERS or whatever, or if you're just like a high net worth individual who would normally just be able to put all their money into index funds or something like that, and expect like a certain level of growth, when you can make 5% just by throwing your money into a savings account at a bank, then more speculative investments like investing in small companies that may or may not work out. And venture capital, my understanding is you get like an entire basket of companies, and a majority of them are going to fail, but one of them might be a Stripe, one of them might be an Airbnb, right? And as a result, you can kind of like spread a whole lot of bets and know that you're going to like statistically make that money back. But there's a lot of disincentive to that when you can just much more safely make the money, thanks to the high interest rates. So my understanding is that this change that happened, over the past few years, like the interest rate has gradually gone up, and it may eventually go back down, but it's back at around historic levels. And in fact, like near zero interest rates were a historic aberration. That's not common for interest rates to be that low in any country other than maybe like Japan, which has had like extended low interest rates and even deflation and stuff, right? So the reason I say all this is just to give people some quick context in case they don't have time to watch that pragmatic engineer talk, but I do encourage you to watch it and watch this QA afterward. But I'm not sure if you've seen that talk, but can you talk a little bit about now that growth is not, obviously investors still want growth. That's why you invest in a company, is you want the stock to go up so you can, sell the stock at a higher price than you bought it, in the future, right? And all that, that stock price is discounted cash flow values of the expected earnings of that company in perpetuity, right? So if I guess my question, sorry, this is like a really rambling question, but how has that changed things in the Valley? And like your experience as both an engineer, as a startup founder who's gone out and raised VC, who's gone through Y Combinator, a very prestigious accelerator program in the Bay Area. Like how do you see things having changed for businesses in tech?
Yeah. The way I think about it is that the interest rates will dictate what is the priority at the moment. Is it growth or profit? With a lower interest rate, then there'll be more focus on growth. And with a higher interest rate, there'll be more focus on profit. So I do think that businesses are very short-term focused, which is, good or bad, but that's the fact of how a lot of companies operate. So I think the meta point I want to make first is that for people watching who are thinking about going into tech or they're already in tech, I want you to realize that your career is long. So just because the interest rate right now in 2024, 2025 is higher than it's been historically, I want you to succeed, and I want you to have a huge, a fulfilling, long, very highly paid career for 20 years. That's like time horizon on which I want you to think about, 10 or 20 years. And so if you zoom out like that, I do think that there's a broader tailwind of the importance of software, and you can benefit from that. Yeah, so coming back to the conversation here, though, I do think that I feel lucky for that it was like a 3, 4, 5, maybe 10-year period even, where interest rates were quite low, and there was a huge emphasis on growth. And that emphasis on growth coincided with when I was growing my career, and I was able to kind of supercharge my growth or even perhaps earn more money. I got lucky to be part of these IPOs that really did well. And I think now there is a lot more focus on we need to not hire as much, maybe even lay people off in order to control our costs and show shareholders that we are diligent with our spending and we're actually working toward a profit, or we are profitable. So a couple of things I'll say is the one is that tech industry now is huge. It's like literally 10x bigger than what it was 20 years. I mean, I made that up, but it's dramatically bigger than it was than what the tech industry was 5, 10, 20 years ago. And so I think that we'll talk about job searching tactics in a little bit, but the number one advice I have for folks is that don't view the tech industry as this huge blob of like a single blob of like just a tech job or not. There are pockets of the tech industry which will be growing faster than the average, and they'll be hiring a lot, right? The tech industry is big enough now where you're going to have these discrepancies. So just focus on those, figure out where you can have a unique value to the world or to that company. And then the other thing I would add is that startups and big tech is very different. Big tech, if you work at Google or Meta or any of these big companies, then there's a quarterly earnings report. And there's going to be a lot of focus on how do we make sure that we show high EPS, earnings per share, how do we show growth, how do we show all these different things on a 3-month time horizon. So you're on that clock. Whereas a startup, usually there's perhaps a bit more leeway. If they're like just raised a seed round or they just raised a Series A, they might not be as focused on profit because they sold a promise, they sold a narrative of rapid growth.
Yeah.
And so those companies might still be hiring, and I would just encourage people to think about the difference between early stage startups, which have a different mindset, compared to later stage tech companies. Awesome.
So one question I have, just a quick follow-up question before we move on, is do you think that a lot of those jobs, like where, Facebook's XYZ department laid off N people, or Google's XYZ product line, like they laid off N people who are working on that product, like do you think that those particular products within those companies are going to hire more people in the future, or do you think that they're going to just have smaller teams going forward and they're going to open new products and hire to fill those teams? Or how do you see those companies going about, rebuilding their engineer base, if you will, like the people? And do you think it's going to be just like uniform across the entire company? They're just bringing more people on, or do you think that like there's going to be more solved problems that are being maintained, and then there are going to be new areas they bring people on?
I definitely think that it'll be lumpy in that
there are always going to be a couple projects which have the lion's share of time and attention and money in a big tech company, and then a lot of products that are just going to be in maintenance mode, and then a lot that are also just not that important, or just like the bare minimum to get by in terms of like, I don't know, like a support function. So I would say that one thing which is really interesting with big tech in particular is that money is not the scarce resource. They have like Google and Apple and all these Fortune 100 companies. They actually have more cash than they know what to do with. Like they have literally tens of billions of dollars in the bank, or maybe hundreds of billions. And so for them, I think the way they make decisions about resourcing is not so much about can we afford it, because they can definitely afford it. It's much more a conversation of what do we actually want to prioritize in terms of a bet, and what do we think, what projects do we think could turn into a multi-billion-dollar opportunity? Because if you're Google, you're not going to waste your time with something which can only, quote unquote, only make 10 million a year. That's way too small for you to even think about. You need to figure out what are the projects that could potentially add $1 billion or 10 billion or 100 billion to your market cap. And so that is, I think, if I had to guess, like what the Google leadership or Apple leadership or whatever, that's how they're thinking about it in terms of staffing is, okay, in this new environment, the time horizons might have shrunk. So instead of a 10-year time horizon, we want something to be showing profit or revenue in 2 years instead of 5 years. And what do we think is the top priority? And then we staff those accordingly. And a lot of things that are much more experimental, they might get cut and then never come back in this environment.
Awesome. Given that, what kind of developer roles are still being filled? What kind of devs are still getting jobs at like the higher? Like I think a lot of devs can go and get a job that pays them less than they were making at like a FAANG company, because they could go to work at a bank or a hospital chain or something like that and apply the skills they learned working at a Google or a Facebook. But what kind of devs are still getting jobs at big tech companies where, I guess, again, I don't want to stereotype like those jobs as being the most competitive, but I would argue in many ways, I mean, working for NASA might be way harder than working at Google, for example. But like for the I guess high paying developer jobs, what kind of skills do you think people like those employers are looking for, and what kind of backgrounds do you think they're hiring for?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a hard time answering that question, because I think the way I think about it is that for people I work with, people who are like, I had this company called Taro, which is about helping developers. For people who join Taro, for the developer that I think about, I want you to be in the top 10% of whatever it is that you're doing. And so if you're let's say that you come to me and say, hey, I'm an Android developer. Do you think that's a good fit for me? Like, will I have a job that way? And I will say, like, broadly speaking, I do think that mobile is not as hot as what it was when I was, picking it up in 2015, 2016. Now the hot area might be like data or ML or AI. But if you're in the top 10% of Android, I can guarantee you will get a job, right? So I think that a lot of the dialogue or conversation ends up being, okay, for the median developer, will the median Android developer get a good job versus a median like SQL database engineer? And, I'm not actually that sure. Maybe data or AI will do better. I think it probably does do better than mobile. But
in terms of compensation or in terms of being able to get jobs?
I would say both. Yeah, like those are correlated in the sense that the more job opportunities there are for like a machine learning engineer, that will often skew toward higher compensation. But I think for people who are watching, I want you to have the belief that you are in the top 10% of your field. Like, you have worked hard enough, you have the right network, you have the skills to be in the top 10% of Android developers or machine learning developers. And if you're in the top 10%, then I can guarantee that you will find a way to get a really compelling job opportunity. So it's kind of a non-answer to your question, but I do think that as long as you focus on the network and just being one of the better people in your field, then no matter what part of software you're in, I think you'll end up having a good job. And we can talk about tactics and how to do that.
Yeah.
But that's how I think about that job search. Rather than thinking about the technology of like, oh, I want to learn, JavaScript, I want to learn Python, I want to learn, this particular framework. I don't think about it from that perspective. I think about it more in terms of who are the people I know or the knowledge I have, which will more easily allow me to become a top 10% developer in that field. And if I do that, then everything else will take care of itself.
So it sounds like you're advocating for really going deep and specializing as a developer right now. And historically, like generalists, as you said, like university degrees often produce generalist developers, and through a series of internships or a series of jobs, they come to be specialists. Like you specialized in Android app development and worked as an Android developer for many years, and you're probably in the top % of Android developers on Earth, right? But that came with a whole lot of dedication and time and energy. What would you say to somebody who is just coming out of a computer science program, or is just finishing like a series of FreeCodeCamp certifications, or is just finishing like doing a whole bunch of self-study at the library and answering a bunch of questions on LeetCode or something like that? Like, what would you say to them in terms of how they should approach specializing? And do you think they should try to specialize now, or do you think they should try to specialize through employment?
I do think that, broadly speaking, going deep in one area is very valuable early in career. Depth, I think, is super valuable, more than breadth early in career, because I don't want to hire someone who have to spoon feed and handhold on every domain. Like, what's much more attractive as an employer is you tell me, hey, I built 5 Android apps. You can see how good they are in the Play Store. Clearly, I'm competent. I'm one of the better Android developers out there. I can come in and I can lead this function, or at least I can be independent. Most junior developers, most entry-level developers are not independent. At Facebook, E3 engineers, which is entry-level engineers, were often considered more of a neutral or negative to the team rather than a positive, right? The idea is that, hey, they're going to come in and it's actually going to be a tax on the team, on the other developers, because they're going to have to ask a bunch of questions, take up time with other developers. They actually will end up hurting the productivity of the team. Later on, it will help. But if you can instead flip that narrative and say, hey, I'm going to come in as a fresh graduate from a boot camp or a computer science program, and here are things that I know how to do really well, as evidenced by all these published projects. I think that it really does help getting you a job. And the other element of it too, which I think is super important, is that I think it's helpful to be polarizing. And what I mean by that is, don't try and be everything to everyone. Or if you say something really generic, like I'm a full stack developer and I do Java, and I do Python, and I do, list all 20 languages, my immediate reaction to that is that you probably don't know any of those languages really well. Whereas instead, if you pick a lane and say, hey, I am a very deep Android developer. I know Kotlin, I know Java, I know Jetpack Compose, I know all these different tools and technologies related to Android. Now, I feel much better about actually hiring you for that role. Yeah, you're not going to be a good fit for like a machine learning role now. So you've kind of eliminated that. You've become polarizing and you're eliminating a lot of jobs for yourself. But for the jobs where you do declare yourself to be a good fit, you have a much, much higher chance. That's another benefit, I think, of specializing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's super helpful. Be polarizing, as Rahul says. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So that is like super actionable advice for folks out there. And yeah, it's like, what would you consider to be enough of a general baseline? If you just had to rattle off some skills that you think like everybody has, just off the top of your head, like every developer should probably know these key things. And then once you know those key things, start specializing. Like just off the top of your head, what are some things that you think are super valuable?
I mean, I think that just in a normal curriculum, just having a very basic familiarity with, I would say, like 3 or 4 languages is important, just so I have faith that you could pick up something else quickly. Like the common ones might be Java, C++, Python, JavaScript, like just familiarity with a handful of those. So it's not like you only know one language. That's not a good indicator for a strong software engineer if you only know one. Like you should be able to learn and pick up different things. That's one. Terminal familiarity. Like, are you able to run commands and understand how they work is kind of obvious one that most developers will have to deal with. And then I think one thing which is also, for me, I bias heavily toward people who have something published. Like, put your name on something that you have majority built out. So not part of a team of 5 or 10 or 100 people. That's the beauty of Android, I think, is that you can, or mobile, is that you can literally publish end-to-end an entire app with just you. That's pretty amazing. Even if not, like back end, maybe it's harder to showcase what you're doing. But show me a GitHub repository where you've done something novel, something beyond a tutorial. I think that is a really core skill of every developer, and then once you have that, then you can kind of specialize a bit more. But it's like, show me that you have the competency to do something without the training wheels of a tutorial.
Awesome. And I want to go to something you've said in some of your videos and your interviews. You've said that developer jobs are high leverage. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the idea of leverage is how much output do you get for a certain amount of input. So like the classic way of contrasting it is with taxi drivers. And so, if you're an average taxi driver, you might go from point A to point B in like 20 minutes. And then a really, really amazing taxi driver can get you from point A to point B in like 15 minutes because they like take turns in a more effective way. They don't fully stop at stop signs. All these things they can do to cut the time down. On the other hand, the gap between an average developer who can like build a project or like add a feature from A to B, it might take them a month. A much, much better developer can probably get that same feature done in 1/10 the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like literally it might take a day or two. That's where you get the term of 10x developers.
So do you believe, just for the record, because a lot of people, this is somewhat polarizing discussion, do you believe 10x engineers are a thing?
Yes, they're 100% a thing. And in fact, 100x developers and 1,000x developers are also a thing.
So who is a famous 100x or 1,000x, like a Steve Wozniak type character or somebody like that?
Yeah, I mean, like there are these legendary programmers that you keep hearing about, like Jeff Dean, Steve Wozniak, Sanjay Gamawat. But I think a lot of it is also contextual. Of like a 10x engineer is not just in a vacuum a 10x engineer. A lot of how they have such a huge amount of impact is that they know the business context. So for example, going back to this idea of like this arbitrary like feature A to feature B, like you're building out something. So a 10x engineer is not someone who writes 10x more code. They could maybe say, hey, actually 90% of the project spec to build feature A, whatever we call it, feature B, 90% of it is actually stupid. We're not going to do any of that. No one cares about that. I'm not even going to think about it. All I really care about is the 10% of the project which actually matters. I'm going to spend my time coding that. There you go. Now you've become a 10x engineer because you're focusing on the work that actually matters. And so that's not about how much technical prowess you have or technical depth you have. It's more about understanding what does a customer want and how do you back into that. So I think it's obvious to me that those kind of engineers do exist, and they'll become more and more prominent actually with AI tools, which will magnify the leverage of a developer.
Awesome. Yeah, so it sounds like a 10x developer or a 100x or a 1000x is a developer who knows what not to do, what is not going to bear fruit, what doesn't matter for the, I guess, business case or whatever they're trying to solve for, and is able to see like the through line to where they need to be and not squander a lot of time doing other things. And yes, like if you're just trying to output code and get a bunch of commits in and have something to talk about during the stand-up meeting, that may not be the path to becoming a 10x or a 100x developer. Right. Whereas, just like thinking really hard and then developing the solution to the fundamental underlying problem after asking why a whole bunch and getting to the root of the problem. So, you believe that's the path to becoming a 10x developer?
Yeah, 100%. So I think one very common template to become a 10x developer is just working on the right thing. So like, don't waste your time. Like the reality in software, because the beauty of software and also the hard part about software is that it's so easy to write and rewrite and delete that, you have these developers or companies that have millions and millions of lines of code, and the majority of it is like not doing very much. So part of it is like figuring out what to actually work on. There's another element too. The second very common template to become a 10x developer is make the people around you better. Like there's a good example when I was working at Facebook, which is a developer, and we had this kind of messy modular code base. And what he did, which is very simple, is like just break it down into different components. So now each developer, when they write code, they don't have merge conflicts. They don't have to step on the toes of other developers who are, adding their own logic. So that's actually kind of a simple change. It's refactoring this component to make it independent. But he made it so that every other developer on the team could move a lot faster. So that's a very easy way to now all of a sudden become a 10x engineer because you've made 5 people around you, twice as efficient, right? So that's another very common common
So
practice.
as a hiring manager, which I know you are, you can look at potential hires as, is this person going to potentially like use critical thinking and reasoning to identify the most important work that needs to be done and the best way to do that at any point, and that is going to be a huge value unlock? Or is this person going to figure out ways of refining processes to just make the overall engine hum more efficiently within my team? Yeah. That's a great insight.
I think one of the criteria, in fact, for the more senior people that we hire in big tech, and even with Taro, like the people who I work with, is will they make me better? Will they make the people around me better? And if I don't actually have faith that there's something that you can teach, something that you can talk about that makes me or the teammates around me better, I probably won't hire you. Like that's almost like baked into the criteria of, do you have something to offer to up-level the team?
Awesome. I have some rapid fire questions for you. I want to be mindful of your time, but I have so many things to ask you because you have expertise. As you mentioned, Taro, I think it's jointaro.com.
Yeah, jointaro.com. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, your startup, which has gone through Y Combinator, and I'm a part of your Slack group, and you've got a lot of momentum around just helping people with developer careers. So you are precisely the kind of person I should be peppering with developer career questions. So I'm not going to squander this opportunity. If you were working at a big tech company right now, how would you approach changing jobs?
The number one advice I have for people who want to change jobs is figure out your unfair advantage and leverage that. So what that means is, let me tell you what not to do. If there's an open opportunity on LinkedIn or Indeed.com and you apply for it, I just think that the amount of effort you put into that is going to yield so few results, because a job posting on LinkedIn, within 24 hours, I've heard of stories where they get literally hundreds or thousands of applicants. So you are competing against perhaps 1,000 or 10,000 people applying for that job. So instead, what I want you to do is I want you to figure out, what is your unfair advantage? Where do you have a referral, a strong referral for someone who works at a company who can advocate for you? And so now, instead of competing with 10,000 people applying for a job online, you might be one of 3 or 4 people who have a strong referral to that company. Or maybe when you look at your resume or your LinkedIn, something will stand out. It's like, okay, clearly the thing that stands out to me is that you are very spiky, like you're polarizing in terms of being an exceptional, like a iOS developer. So, okay, now that should be how you frame your job search. Like figure out companies that really are desperate for an iOS engineer. And now you have a way bigger advantage there compared to like Google. At Google, I'm sure there's probably some job opening for an iOS developer at Google. I'm sure there is. But you don't have an unfair advantage to get into that. Whereas a startup that is really focused, their whole product strategy is focused on mobile and iOS in particular, you have a unique ability to go to them and say, hey, I can fulfill your need. And so that would be like the number one advice I have if you're in big tech. Figure out where do you have a huge advantage compared to the general population and orient your whole job search around that.
What are some of the important aspects of soft skills? You've talked a lot about the importance of soft skills. Can you define soft skills, and what are some specific soft skills that developers should focus on that will yield big returns to effort?
Yeah, I mean, soft skills is basically anything which is not directly related to the technology, to the coding. And that was the gap that I observed, especially among engineers, in myself, with soft skills, is a huge part of why I even felt comfortable, or I had this desire to start jointaro.com, is I felt like that was very underserved for technical folks. So like a very common one that I talk about is, how do you ask a good question? That is such a fundamental soft skill. Is, I don't care how smart you are, I don't care your background, you are going to have questions about the code base or about the company or about the team whenever you join a new environment, inevitably. So how do you frame your question in a way which not only gets you the information you want, but also critically is valuable to build a relationship with the people around you? And
yeah, so maybe
there's like a... Like,
I was just going to say, like relays that you do have some... It's not a quote-unquote dumb question. It's a well-informed kind of surgical question.
Yes.
That
It's a
is going to make them
volatile
respect
question.
you. Oh, good question.
Yes, that, and also like you can also view the question as an asset that will help build up your social capital. So, for example, if you ask a question in a DM, that's one of the things I tell people not to do, because now you've lost that knowledge. That interaction is now lost in the ether between me and Quincy. Whereas if I put it in a public forum and I tell Quincy, hey, over here in Slack or in this like email thread, I left a question. I think you have a ton of great insight. I would love for you to answer it. Now, the next person who onboards after me, they can go through that history and benefit from it too. It's like kind of having the awareness or thought process to figure out how can I ask the question in a way that gets me the answer, builds a relationship, and also helps everyone else around me, like the next person who onboards. I think that's the kind of thing that really does differentiate a 10x developer and an average developer. And I think a lot of people get lucky by having a mentor or having someone in their career who can help them with that. A lot of people don't. They just get stuck doing things in the same old way. And that's what I'm hoping that we can try and make some of that knowledge free for everyone.
100%. That's one of the reasons it's an honor to be able to grab you and ask questions.
Yeah.
And hopefully improve at asking questions, as I've got like 50 hours of experience this year doing podcast interviews, right? So what are some other soft skills? Because I'm sure there are a lot of them. Are there any other ones that immediately come to mind that you think people neglect?
I mean, I think another huge one that comes up again and again is career growth, right? So how can I advocate for myself? How can I do skillful self-promotion in a way which is not, oh, here's how great I am, I want a promotion now, help me. Instead, talk about, okay, here's the work I've done, here's why I think it could benefit you. And in the process of benefiting you and benefiting the team and helping the company, I would love to continue to grow my career and take it even further. How can we work together to make sure that happens? Like framing the conversation in a way where your career growth is not on the back burner, and yet it's also not the like be all end all of what your manager is thinking about, and recognizing that is something that comes up again and again where people get frustrated. Like, I'm not growing in my career. And then I ask about, what are they doing? Are they asking questions? Are they proactive about getting feedback? Are they trying to figure out what the career matrix even looks like at their company? And I think a lot of people just haven't done that much thinking about it. And so being able to have some sort of framework or structured approach to thinking about performance review and promotion is another fundamental soft skill that most engineers don't think about.
And I want to point out that you have, I think, twice as many followers on LinkedIn as I do. You've got like more than 100,000 followers on LinkedIn, which is not like a platform that a lot of people think of in terms of, I guess, self-promotion and establishing credibility. Can you talk a little bit about the use of LinkedIn for yourself as a developer, as an entrepreneur, and as whether LinkedIn is a helpful tool for developers trying to gradually build up their reputation and their network and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so LinkedIn and YouTube are hugely important to me as a way for me to share a lot of the opinions or advice I have, or just share the opinions of other people who I might be able to interview and share their platform. And so the way I think about it is, what I care about is, I have this thing called Taro. It's a membership product that I genuinely believe can help people in their career. And so YouTube and LinkedIn, I think you asked about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a really powerful way for me to tell people about that. I don't do it in like a marketing way. I try not to. The way I think about LinkedIn, or really any social media, is that the way you win, the way you grow, the way you add value is you need to show up every day, every week, and you need to provide a ton of value for free over a long period of time. And if you do that consistently, not just for a week or a month, but if you do that for 2 or 3 years, like I've been doing. I've been on YouTube since 2019. I've been posting almost every day on LinkedIn for 2.5 years or more than 2 years. If you do that, then inevitably you will start to have people who recognize your name, recognize your brand, and then trust you enough. You've earned their trust. And then you can direct them toward a video or Taro or whatever else it is that you think that will help them. But you have to earn that by showing up every day for a long period of time.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of people just kind of show up and they think that like they don't need to spend years potentially building out not just the skills, but also the reputation.
And this is also
network.
where quantity over quality comes back too, right? It's like if you come and say, okay, I'm going to spend, a week writing out this amazing LinkedIn post talking about my whole life story. I want to put it out there. It might do well. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm sure if someone comes out on LinkedIn and like talks about something really compelling, it'll do well. But the way you actually do well, the way you win over the long term, is you need to have enough quantity. Not like quantity for the sake of quantity, but like you need to continue trying to get better at your craft over a long period. And only then do you earn the right to be able to, capture people's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I will say that if you like having written, I think, more than 500 programming tutorials over the past 10 years myself, there have been a few like outlier hits, and I didn't necessarily know in some cases that those would be outlier hits, but there were some where I'm like, wow, I've got something really special here. And I'll point to like a post I discovered recently. My friend sent it to me, and it was this guy's story of how his father died, and he went back to India, and he ran his father's chemical company. I don't know if you read this amazing story, but it's basically like it's a single article, but it represents like an entire 2 years of his life, like learning how to run a chemical company and learning how like all the cultural differences and everything he had to take in, having grown up in the U.S. and having to go back and communicate with his staff and like basically figure out a way to gracefully exit with the company and find an acquirer. And I mean, that is like, a 30-minute read, 40-minute read. There's like, I can only imagine how many hundreds of hours went into that, but I'm sure tens of thousands of people read that. So there is something to be said for just having a single very high quality article. But I would be willing to bet that developer had spent a lot of time just writing over the years, just blogging regularly and things like that. So they had built up those muscles and built up that kind of like mentality. So even if it feels like a lot of your quantity is not hitting, it's not connecting with audience and stuff, you're still getting benefit in terms of, as you said earlier, like the way to become good at coding is just code a whole lot, right? Yep. That's probably the best single indicator of somebody who's good at coding is somebody who spends a whole lot of time coding.
And also content is another area where it is extremely high leverage in that the gap between an average piece of content, which might get, I don't know, for my LinkedIn, an average post might get 20,000 views, impressions. An amazing post might get 10 million. So it's not just like, oh, it's like 20% better. It's like literally 100x better in terms of the amount of traffic or amount of like impact you can have on the world with that piece of content, which is another reason why I think, content, social media can be really powerful if used effectively.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I want to ask a few quick questions about developers like who are applying for jobs right now. Let's presume, I think you and I have established that you need to have general skills, general knowledge. You want to specialize you want to be polarizing, and you want to be in the top % working with, even if it's some relatively esoteric tool. Like you could go get a COBOL job right now if you really want to go deep on COBOL. There are COBOL jobs, and there are not a lot of people that want to work with COBOL. There are lots of people that are still using like Cold Fusion, WordPress, like old technology to run their e-commerce operations. And if you become a known quantity in those fields, you can go get a job, right? But let's say that you've already done all that and you want to go out and get a job. Conventional wisdom is you try to shop around a whole lot of different competing offers and like collect a lot of offers. Like you were able to time your acquisition of different offers from big tech companies to where you had this window and you could like kind of play them against each other and negotiate. Do you think with the job market the way it is for developers right now, developers still have the luxury to do that?
I think some developers do. I mean, definitely there are, not all developers are created equal, or not all profiles, I should say, are created equal. Like if you went to a name brand school, if you are working at OpenAI, I can guarantee you there's like hundreds of companies knocking on your door to hire an OpenAI engineer, for example, right? So I do think it's possible. It's certainly harder now compared to 2021 or 2020. What I would say is that figure out what is actually important to you. Like if you're starting out your career and you're breaking into tech for the first time, then it's not that important to get 5 offers. Like what you want really at the end of the day is you want to get one offer which is compelling and hopefully at a name brand company or institution, and then you leverage that as a jumping off point for your next job. Like don't think about like very few developers these days will stick around in a job for like 20 years. So I think a better approach is, okay, like let me do this job for the time being, and then it'll open up new possibilities. And then once I have those in my hand, I'll then evaluate them and make the best decision for myself. But right now, just think about the next 1 or 2 year time horizon rather than thinking about the next 20 years.
Awesome. And do you think that developers still have like would you still encourage people to negotiate salary the way that they did historically, or do you think that the job market has fundamentally changed where that's not safe to do anymore?
No, I think the answer to negotiation is always yes, if done in the right way. It's like you don't want to obviously piss people off and like lie about like, oh, I have this other offer. Like obviously that's kind of going to put you in hot water. But I do think that no matter the job market condition, it's always worth trying to negotiate. It might not be effective today because whereas in 2021 you might have had like 5 offers, where today you might only have 1 offer. Of course, the amount of leverage you have is a lot lower, but I still think it's worth making an ask, and it might be rejected, but at least you've made the ask.
Awesome. What would you say to a developer who's getting into the field and has heard, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, say, "Oh, you don't need to teach your kids to code anymore. Like coding is going to be a solved thing, and we're just going to have AI magic that takes care of all of software engineering." Like, what would you say to somebody who is feeling discouraged because they've heard some kind of like marketing talk like that? And like what would you? I don't want to catch the question in too much, but just like, okay, I'm gonna pretend to be this person. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure my job's just going to be automated by the time I finish learning all this stuff anyway.
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, I disagree with this hypothesis that coding jobs will disappear. I think the way we code and the types of problems we solve with coding, those might change. And so if you are expecting to have the same kind of job, like let's say you're writing a for loop or like doing these more rudimentary programming tasks, you should expect that to change. But the actual job of being able to communicate with a computer, whether we call that a programmer or a developer or engineer or something else we call it in the future, that problem, I am very confident, will continue to be in high demand. And in fact, the demand will increase a lot in the coming years. And so that's the first thing I would say, is that I just think that it's not true that programmers will not exist in the next 20 or 30 years. Like they will exist. The other thing I would say is that your goal should be to be in the top 10%. Like your goal is not to be a bottom of the barrel, like barely scraping by developer. I want you, if you're going to enter this field, you should be, and I want you to be in the top 10%. And so if you think you have a chance of doing that, then that should give you more confidence that your job in particular will be really well taken care of. And in fact, even more important, because like you have this skill set that not most people in the world have, and your leverage will be magnified, amplified with the changes coming to programming with AI.
Let's say let's take 2 candidates or 2 people, right? There is a software engineer or like a computer science senior at Stanford who has done a few internships, and they are graduating and they are entering the job force. And I would probably, posit that aside from being like a proven 10x developer or something, they are probably the hottest commodity for a lot of like entry level jobs, right? What would somebody outside of the brand of Stanford, outside of the, I guess, cultural cachet of established computer science degree programs, like having a bachelor's in computer science, that carries a lot of weight. And I tell everybody if they're going to go to university, they should absolutely study computer science. I think it's a great field to go into. But let's say hypothetically, you don't have that luxury. I've got an English degree. I'm a teacher. I'm 30, right? This actually describes where I was when I started coding back, 15 years ago. What would I need to do to be able to get to that level of appealingness that recent Stanford, or the person who's about to graduate from Stanford's computer science program, we get to?
So I would say, first of all, I don't think the goal should be to be that appealing to everyone. Like the goal should be, you're not trying to appeal to everyone, right? You're trying to get 1, maybe 2 or 3 job offers. So that means that really what you care about is there's a set of 10 people at these 2 or 3 companies that will make a decision, a judgment on you. Your job is to impress them. You don't care about the 100,000 other people or companies that are hiring. You care about 2 companies that are going to hire you and take a bet on you. That's all you care about. So let's reduce the problem scope into something much more tractable. The other thing I would say is that trust is the most important asset when it comes to hiring. And so the benefit of now having a much smaller problem space is that you're not trying to build trust with 100,000 people, which is impossible. Unless you if you went to Stanford, then maybe inherently you have some trust. Like people kind of just assume that you have some level of legitimacy, but you don't have that luxury. And so all you really care about is how can I quickly build trust with 2 or 3 people at these key companies. And the way you do that is, again, go and leverage your unfair advantage. So let's say you're an English major. You probably have, let's say that you worked as like a historian, or you worked at a library. And it just so happens that there was a customer or like a visitor at the library who was working in tech. Guess what? That is your unfair advantage. Go and talk to that person and say, hey, I want to learn more about your job and your company. Can we hop on a call? And if you do that, with like 10 people, I guarantee 1 or 2 of them will feel comfortable. They'll trust you, and therefore they will feel comfortable advocating for you in a particular job. So it might not, like, it's hard to give like a template answer, but like I think be creative with how you can talk to people, how you can find opportunity. Like maybe go to build an app and ask for feedback on it. Like figure out ways you can engage with people so that they start to trust you. And as soon as you have a critical mass of people who trust you, that is how you're able to get a job, even though you don't have this, Harvard degree on your resume.
Yeah. Yeah. And just in case anybody's curious, my unfair advantage was I was pretty good at winning hackathons. So I won a bunch of hackathons around the Bay Area.
Unfair advantage. Yeah, that's amazing.
And by doing that, then I kind of proved out the concept of me as a software engineer and made it, like, I guess, less risky for a hiring manager to take a chance on me and bring me in as, one of those low-level kind of like net negative engineers on a team who's gradually going to learn the skills and eventually be a net positive, right?
Yep.
So if anybody wants to learn more about that, I've written a book. It's free. It's called How to Learn to Code and Get a Developer Job. It echoes a lot of what you said here, Rahul, but there's a whole lot of additional insight that you've layered on. And of course, I'm going to encourage everybody to check out Taro. Is there anything else that people should check out from you? I think that they should follow you on LinkedIn. I follow you on LinkedIn. Yeah. I encourage everybody. You're constantly showing up and delivering value to people there. But like just in imparting, like anything else people should do.
That's great. I think LinkedIn and jointaro.com are where I am very active. YouTube also. I have a YouTube channel under my name, Rahul Pandey. So would love for people to check that out and share whatever feedback or questions they have. I'd love to help out.
Rahul, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for everything you've done for the FreeCodeCamp community over the past 4 or 5 years through creating these free learning resources and creating resources through other means that I know there's a huge overlap. There's a big Venn diagram of people who are like making use of FreeCodeCamp, people who are like learning from you directly through your YouTube channel. So thanks for everything you're doing for the developer community. Keep it up, man.
Yes, it is really my pleasure, and I appreciate all the work that you all have been doing as well at FreeCodeCamp. So it's been great.
Awesome. Well, everybody who's made it this far, be sure to subscribe to the podcast feed if you're listening. Like, make sure you click the plus thing and follow in Apple Podcasts or in Spotify or wherever. And look for more insight like this. Until next week, happy coding.
Bye.